So I read this little story you might be able to identify. Recently, our 18-year-old daughter started hunting for her first real job. She spent an afternoon filling out applications, leaving them on the kitchen table to finish later. And as I walked by, the person telling the story, a section of the application on top jumped out at me. Under previous employment, she had written babysitting. The answer to reason for leaving: parents came home. I particularly like this one. If you take great expectations and throw a comma in there, that's what I'm thinking when I'm reading my job description. Great expectations? And finally, for some of you who are job hunting, how to respond to those dreaded rejection letters. Dear Mr. Kenley, thank you for your letter of April 17th, which I must return. After careful consideration, I regret to inform you that I am unable to accept your written refusal to offer my employment with your firm. This year I've been particularly fortunate in receiving several rejection letters, and it is impossible for me to accept all refusals. Priority will be given to those hiring managers who are so kind as to call with the bad news. Despite your company's outstanding qualifications and previous experience in rejecting applicants, I find that your rejection does not meet with my needs at this time. Therefore, I will initiate employment with your firm again in the near future. Best of luck in rejecting future candidates. Job hunting. We spend a certain amount of our life trying to decide what our job in life is. What are our abilities and what should we be doing? Sometimes this involves gaining access to specialized training. Sometimes it involves on-the-job training. Job hunting takes time and effort. It also takes perseverance, a little toughening of the skin. Job hunting is not for the weak of spirit. It involves time when we feel frustrated and rejected and even sometimes desperate. Our ideal future involves meaningful employment, or employment sufficiently lucrative that we can afford to do something meaningful with the hard-earned wages. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, Paul describes the most important job that we will ever do. For we are God's servants, working together. You are God's field, God's building. Paul is addressing the church in Corinth and speaking to them all together. We sometimes call this a mission statement in today's lingo. What is your mission in life? As individuals, our missions sometimes fade into the background as we are assaulted with messages about what we need to be or do to survive. We need to handle our financial obligations. We need to become independent and self-actualizing. True. However, most of all, we need to claim the reason for our existence. And that is much more important than the house we live in, the car we drive, or the status we have in the community. The Catechism indicates that the reason for our existence, the most important job we can hold, is to glorify God in everything that we do. As the family, the church, each of us has unique gifts and calling, and together our mission is to glorify God. There's no other reason for us to come together. The fact that we form community and it meets our personal needs of togetherness and connectedness is one of those wonderful fruits of the reality that we exist to glorify God, our Maker. Paul is calling the church at Corinth, each person in that church, to identify with their job as fellow laborers. Fellow laborers. I know that's not, appropriate in this feminist age, but co-laborers didn't quite do the same thing for me. And he does say fellow laborers. And somebody has said of that passage, fellow laborers in God's employ under his direction. This is somebody who knows how to read the Greek and elucidate for us exactly what the author was saying. And this person goes on to share, as we say of servants in the same rank, we are fellow laborers of the same master. Not meaning that the master is engaged necessarily in working with us, but that we are fellow laborers one with another in his employ. Interesting kind of nuance. Further, he goes on to say, God does not operate jointly with his creatures in producing the same result. We may be engaged in regard to the same end. God works toward the end that God has defined. But we each have our own sphere of operations. And our operations are distinct. God does one thing and we do another, though we may contribute to the same results. The sphere of God's operations in the growth of a tree is totally distinct from that of the man who plants it. The man who plants it has no agency in causing the juices to circulate and expanding the bud or the leaf. That is the proper work of God. In 3 John 1:8, Christians are indeed said to be fellow helpers to the truth that is. They operate with the truth and contribute by their labors and influence to that effect. And in Mark, it says that the apostles went forth and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them. Where the phrase means that the Lord cooperated with them by miracles. The Lord, by God's own proper energy and in his own sphere, contributed to the success of the work in which they were engaged. Working with others for a shared end is only typical of certain jobs, as I was saying to the children this morning. And in bringing in the harvest, you have one of the most basic applications of being fellow workers. The harvest needs to be brought in before it rots. It needs to be done in a certain time, and everybody together has got to participate in that one end in a way that we seldom experience it in our segmented lives today. Oh, we have colleagues, but our lives are so specialized that we're often forced to deal with a tiny segment of the job in ignorance of the whole. People that do research and development never know what military establishments are going to do with their research and development. People that do specialized biological research doesn't know what it's going to mean for the medical industry. People that work with chemistry don't always understand what it's going to mean to the pharmaceutical industry. Our lives are so segmented in a way that the people that Jesus talked to never really experienced. In their situations and in much of our rural countryside, if the community doesn't work together, then the community fails. One of the distinctive aspects of the God laborer's job is to negotiate our mortal and temporal reality. God's miraculous agenda needs to function in our physical and emotional world. We speak of Jesus as God made man. God become human. And we use the word incarnate. And we have incarnational theology. We talk about God being in this physical world, limited for a time by the same limitations we experience. We cling to Christ Jesus as the one who truly understands what it means to be completely human, to give up all the wonderful possibilities of being God for a time, and even to experience death. There's a short story by Tolstoy about three questions, a great king and a hermit. I don't know if you've heard it. I had heard it long ago. It begins like this. It once occurred to a certain king that if he always knew the right time to begin everything, if he knew who were the right people to listen to and whom to avoid, and above all, if he always knew what was the most important thing to do, he would never fail in anything he might undertake. Now, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I found it online. It's called The Three Questions by Tolstoy. And like any good story, it takes you by the hand through his search for the answer to these three questions. All the wise people in his kingdom come, and they have all their thoughts on the subject, but he's not satisfied with any of them, and so he decides to go and ask a hermit in the woods the same three questions. But the hermit is not a person who's going to respect his royal entourage and his royal clothes, and so he dresses like the people, the general populace, and he tells his retinue to stay back, and into the forest he goes by himself. And he comes across the hermit digging in the garden and asks the questions, but doesn't get an answer, so he starts to help the hermit. And the hermit then goes to rest, and after a hard day's work, so does the king in the little hut. And the next day, some wounded man comes rushing in, and they suddenly start attending to the wounds of this man out in the forest all by themselves. And the man starts to recover. And another day passes. And then finally, the king hears the story of the wounded man. The wounded man had an argument with the king, and when he came to kill the king, because he knew he'd be alone in the woods, the king's men, back at the edge of the wood, wounded the man who came running in and who now had been so taken care of by the king that he no longer hated him, but they were reconciled and he felt grateful to him for saving his life. And this is what the hermit says in answer to the three questions. Remember then, there is only one time that is important, now. And he says that it's because this is all you have to be effective in. It's the most important time because it's the only time when we have any power. The most necessary man is the person with whom you are, for no one knows whether he will ever have dealings with anyone else. And the most important affair is to do him good, because for that purpose alone was man sent into this life. Now, this isn't a Christ parable. It is another important kind of way of communicating what's important in life. But I say to you that Jesus came teaching in parables so that our job hunting might be fruitful. Like the king, that we might never fail in anything we undertake. That's why the king asked those three questions, that he might never fail in anything that he undertakes. And that's why Jesus came teaching in parables and calling together the church, that we might be triumphant over our failures in this life. Jesus came saying, now is the important time. And we sometimes struggle with that because the people that heard him really believed it. Right now is going to be the kingdom, and we keep waiting for the kingdom to come in all of its fruition, and yet we know that God's time is not like our time. And I say to you, now is the most important moment. You can't put off being who God needs you to be. This is the present age, the time in which we need to act, and that our actions must be for the salvation of the world. This is what it means to be co-workers with God. With our limited resources, we must make decisions to deal with the immediate needs of our time, for our families, for our God's message, and for our world. I was so glad to be downtown yesterday. Oh, when I got up in the morning and I had to take my meds and I couldn't lay down and I couldn't eat anything for half an hour, I was feeling pretty old and tired. But by the end of the day, and about 3 or 4 trips back here to the church, several of them by foot, I was really glad that God had given me this day to be downtown with our confirmands and several adults. To see them actively involved in the needs of God's world, giving of their time and their talents, working together. Working together. You know, the old-time church used to work together a heck of a lot more than we do today. We used to work together to make meals that would feed all of us. We used to work together to organize the rummage fair. We used to work together to create a food pantry. We used to work together because together was all we had. But today, aren't we lucky? We've got so much more to pull us out of here and away. I was so glad to be downtown, actively involved in the needs of God's world, giving of our time and our talents, working together, and in response to see people stop. I wish you all could have seen our setup. Show interest in the work of this congregation. And you know what? We had lots of things that we could buy for them to enjoy later. But it wasn't so much the buying something to enjoy later, but the putting of your hand into your wallet and taking something out and just giving it as a donation. $20 bills. $10 for a bottle of water that we forced on them. People stopping and wanting to be part of something bigger. More people simply donated funds as they were able than chose to buy anything. How will we be co-workers in God's mission? It takes time, talents, and treasure to be about God's work as individuals and as the church. The church, our church, this little church, the big church we're connected to, the church that's international, the church that is headed for the kingdom of God, that has no more limitations of time and space. But first you need to sit down and ask some questions of your life and make it a priority to address the job hunting. Who will I be? Who am I? And why am I here? We're going to join together in a hymn that was in the previous hymnal of the Methodist Church. So you may actually find it familiar even though it's not in our hymnal today.
Actually, the words may be familiar to you if you have ever seen the Broadway show Godspell.
Uh-oh.
Because what I learned this morning is Stephen Schwartz lifted verse 1 and verse 3 out of this to what is known as All Good Gifts. We're going to sing a Methodist tune today, which, unless you've been here several decades, I don't think you've heard it before.
Oh, I've wandered around the ecumenical world. Some other people sing it too.